One of the biggest questions surrounding the Detroit Lions right now isn't whether Aiden Hutchinson will lead the team in sacks. Almost everyone agrees that he will. The real question is much more important because it could determine just how dangerous this defense becomes during the upcoming season. Who is going to be the second pass rusher that consistently wins one-on-one battles and forces opposing quarterbacks into mistakes? That discussion has suddenly become one of the hottest topics among Lions fans, and when you really look at the numbers, it becomes obvious why this conversation matters so much. A recent fan poll focused entirely on this question, asking supporters who they believe will finish second on the team in sacks behind Hutchinson. The results were surprisingly one-sided. Nearly half of the fans voted for Derek Moore, while DJ Wonnum finished well behind him. Aleem McNeil received a much smaller share of the votes, followed by Jack Campbell and Derek Barnes. But the interesting part isn't simply who received the most votes. It's what those results actually reveal about the expectations surrounding this defense. The overwhelming support for Derek Moore tells us something very important. Lions fans aren't just predicting that he'll become the second leading sack producer. They're hoping he becomes exactly what this defense has been searching for. There's a growing belief that Detroit desperately needs another pass rusher capable of consistently creating pressure without relying on extra blitzers. Fans understand that expecting DJ Wonnum to produce double-digit sacks may not be realistic, and they know Aleem McNeil's primary responsibility isn't piling up huge sack totals. What they're looking for is another edge defender who can regularly win individual matchups alongside Hutchinson. That expectation becomes even more interesting when you compare it to what happened last season. The Lions actually had 2 players finish with more than 10 sacks, which is an outstanding accomplishment for any defense. Having 2 defenders reach double digits is something many teams never achieve. However, there was another side to that story. One of those contributors was primarily used as a pass rushing specialist. While he performed well in obvious passing situations, there were legitimate questions about how consistently he could hold up against the run. That's exactly where many people believe Derek Moore can offer something different. The expectation isn't simply that he can pressure quarterbacks, it's that he can become a much more complete defender who stays on the field in every situation while still creating disruption. But this conversation goes far beyond one individual player. It actually opens the door to understanding something fascinating about how the Detroit Lions play defense as a whole. Many people assume this defense already generates quick pressure because they finished near the top of the league in sacks. Surprisingly, that's not exactly what happened. Detroit finished 4th in the NFL in total sacks last season, something that caught many people by surprise. Even more impressive, they ranked 6th in pressure rate. Those numbers would normally suggest an aggressive defensive front that reaches quarterbacks almost immediately after the snap. But another statistic tells a completely different story. The Lions averaged 2.86 seconds before generating pressure on opposing quarterbacks, making them one of the slowest teams in the league when measuring time to pressure. At first glance, those numbers almost seem impossible to reconcile. How can a defense rank among the NFL's best in sacks while taking longer than almost everyone else to actually reach the quarterback? The answer lies in how this defense is designed. According to Next Gen Stats, time to pressure isn't simply about recording sacks. The clock starts the moment the ball is snapped and stops when a defender gets within 2 yards of the quarterback at the throw or within 1.5 yards at any point during the play. That measurement depends heavily on defensive structure, coverage responsibilities, and overall scheme rather than pure pass rushing ability alone. That's where the Lions become unique. Detroit plays man coverage more frequently than any other team in the NFL, using it on roughly 32% of defensive snaps. At the same time, they rank relatively low in blitz percentage, sending extra rushers only around 23 to 24% of the time. In other words, they're usually asking 4 defensive linemen to generate pressure while trusting their defensive backs to stay attached to receivers long enough for the rush to eventually arrive. It's a completely different philosophy from teams that constantly send 5 or 6 defenders after the quarterback. Instead of manufacturing pressure through blitz packages, Detroit places enormous confidence in its secondary. The coaching staff believes their coverage players can buy the defensive line just enough extra time to finish the play. That approach has already produced impressive results, but it also highlights exactly why adding another reliable pass rusher could completely change this defense. Imagine keeping the exact same coverage philosophy while reducing the average time to pressure by only a fraction of a second. That tiny difference may not sound significant on paper, but on the football field, it can completely change an entire game. Could Derek Moore become the missing piece that transforms good pressure into elite pressure and takes this Detroit Lions defense to another level? The biggest reason this matters is because the Lions don't need to completely reinvent their defense to become even more dangerous. The foundation is already there. They already know how they want to play. They already trust their defensive backs to handle difficult coverage assignments, and they already believe their front four can create enough disruption without constantly bringing extra defenders. What they're looking for now is efficiency. They're looking for someone who can consistently win those one-on-one matchups just a little bit faster. Think about what happens if that average time to pressure drops from 2.86 seconds to somewhere around 7 seconds, while everything else stays exactly the same. That small difference may not sound dramatic, but in the NFL, it's enormous. Quarterbacks live off timing. Every fraction of a second gives receivers more time to separate, gives offensive linemen more time to recover, and gives offenses more opportunities to convert difficult situations. Cut even a few tenths of a second off that clock, and suddenly everything changes. Quarterbacks start feeling pressure before they're ready to throw. Their footwork becomes rushed. Instead of stepping confidently into passes, they begin throwing off their back foot. Reads become quicker, decisions become less accurate, and that's exactly where turnovers start happening. Those happy feet inside the pocket lead to rushed throws that defensive backs are waiting to capitalize on. It doesn't stop there. Every sack creates another difficult down for an offense. Losing yardage doesn't just put the quarterback behind the chains. It changes the entire drive. Third and manageable suddenly becomes third and long. Offensive coordinators are forced to abandon balanced play calling, and quarterbacks are placed into obvious passing situations where the defense knows exactly what's coming. That's when pass rushers become even more dangerous. The Lions have already shown they can force opponents into predictable situations because they've consistently been strong against the run. If offenses struggle to establish their rushing attack, they naturally become more one-dimensional. That means more passing attempts, more obvious passing downs, and more opportunities for Detroit's defensive line to attack. Now imagine pairing that with another edge rusher who consistently wins against single blockers. Of course, everything still starts with Aiden Hutchinson. Every offensive line is going to build its protection plan around slowing him down. Double teams, chips from tight ends, running backs staying in protection. Opponents will continue throwing extra attention his way whenever possible. That's exactly why the player lining up opposite Hutchinson becomes so important. If offenses dedicate multiple blockers to Hutchinson, someone else has to take advantage of the one-on-one opportunities that creates. That's the opportunity many believe Derek Moore could inherit. Instead of asking him to carry the entire pass rush, Detroit simply needs him to consistently beat individual matchups. If he can do that, offenses suddenly face an impossible choice. Continue focusing on Hutchinson and allow Moore to attack favorable matchups, or shift attention toward Moore and give Hutchinson more room to dominate. And Derek Moore isn't the only reason for optimism. The defensive front could receive additional contributions from Aleem McNeil and Tyleik Williams collapsing the pocket from the interior, making life even more difficult for quarterbacks trying to step up and avoid outside pressure. Meanwhile, Levi Onwuzurike also enters the conversation after showing just how disruptive he can be when healthy. It's easy to forget that during the period when Hutchinson missed time, Onwuzurike finished second on the team in total pressures while Hutchinson still remained first. That alone demonstrates how valuable his presence can be when he's available. When you start putting all of those pieces together, you begin to understand why there's so much excitement surrounding this defensive line entering training camp. This isn't simply about adding another player to the rotation. It's about maximizing a defensive system that already proved it can finish near the top of the league in sacks despite taking longer than most teams to generate pressure. If Detroit can maintain its disciplined coverage, continue stopping the run, and shave just enough time off its pass rush, the overall impact could extend far beyond sack totals. More hurried throws, more interceptions, more stalled drives, fewer explosive plays allowed. Those are the kinds of improvements that can completely change close football games over the course of an entire season. Ultimately, that's why so many Lions fans have placed their hopes on Derek Moore becoming that reliable second pass rusher. It's not because they expect him to replace Hutchinson, it's because they believe his development could unlock the full potential of a defense that already has the foundation to compete with the very best in the NFL. If he consistently wins those one-on-one battles, Detroit may not need to change its identity at all. The Lions could simply become a faster, more disruptive version of the defense they've already built. Another reason this storyline deserves so much attention is because the Lions are entering a stage where simply being good at getting sacks may no longer be enough. Expectations have changed. This is no longer a team that is trying to prove it belongs among the NFL's better defenses. The expectation now is to become one of the most complete units in football, and that means finding ways to improve even in areas where the numbers already look impressive. When you see a defense finish 4th in the league in sacks and 6th in pressure rate, the natural reaction is to assume there isn't much room left for improvement. But when you dig deeper into how those numbers were produced, you realize there's still another level this defensive front could reach. That's why the time to pressure statistic is so fascinating. The Lions aren't necessarily lacking production, they're looking for faster production. Every quarterback in the NFL has a rhythm, passing concepts are built around timing, and offensive coordinators know exactly how long each route should take to develop. If the defensive line arrives just before that timing window opens, the offense never has the opportunity to execute as designed. But if the quarterback has even an extra half second, those same plays suddenly become much easier to complete. That's why the Lions' defensive philosophy puts so much responsibility on every player doing his job. The secondary has to remain disciplined in coverage. The defensive line has to stay relentless throughout the play. The front isn't relying on frequent blitzes to manufacture pressure.